Andrés, should artists be concerned about personal information when it comes to minting an NFT?
Well, Francesca, I think that when it comes to that topic, I think that it's a concern that has been raised quite a lot of times in the last couple of years. When it comes not only, when it comes to NFTs, obviously we are, speaking about, the last couple of years, but actually when it comes to blockchain and decentralized technologies in general, I think that it's a question that has been raised quite a lot of times. There has been, several amounts of papers written. A couple of regulators have raised their points, like for example, the French Data Protection Authority in Europe. And I think that it's a tricky question. And I think that I'm going to, relying on my background as a practicing attorney and saying it depends, the answer, in the sense of we have to be, really specific about what is exactly happening in that situation. Obviously, we need to discuss, are we discussing about the introduction of personal data on a platform level, for example, at the level of the Ethereum blockchain, for example, let's say that it is the most used when it comes to NFTs? Are we talking about a particular dApp that is being used to mint NFTs? Are we talking about introducing personal data in the process or the business flow of a particular business or a particular platform that is being used for this purpose? So depending on the level, obviously the answer will depend, and also something that needs to be factored in is the type of blockchain that we are using, for example. That's something that usually we tend to put everything in the same bag, public blockchains or private distributed ledgers. They're not exactly the same thing. There is a lot of there is a clear lack of consensus in general between regulators and academia and practitioners when it comes to this question of actually what is decentralized, what is exactly when it comes to a public blockchain, and actually when it's actually from a factual point of view impossible to assign roles, because when it comes to personal data, basically we are assigning all the obligations, as pretty much in most of regulated fields, to a single entity, the data controller, and we are putting that person in charge of making sure that there is a legal basis to process personal data, that transparency obligations were complied with, that security measures were adopted, that in some cases, for example, a data protection impact assessment was conducted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're putting all those obligations on that person, pretty much as in any other field. For example, in the case of securities, we're putting it into the issuer of the security, for example, when it comes to anti-money laundering, to the obliged subject. Usually law puts obligations on the head of somebody. So when you take that question on a real decentralized situation, for example, on the blockchain of Bitcoin, who is the data controller in that sense? Even with Ethereum, who is a data controller? Every single node that is operating on the network, every single miner. Obviously now with Ethereum, with the change in the protocol and all of that, obviously the answer might change in that sense. So I think that it's not an easy answer. In general, I believe that as we're seeing now how things are operating, I think that in most cases, most personal data is being stored at the service provider level, in this case of companies that are facilitating the process of minting an NFT, because the amount of metadata that the NFT can actually hold, just from an economical point of view, it's expensive, to be expending Ether to actually, put that all information in the Ethereum blockchain. So it doesn't make sense to, be uploading information. But even if it was possible, from a practical point of view, it should be minimized as much as possible, as it's actually happening. I think that I haven't seen any case of, personal data being introduced into the NFT. I think that in most cases, the relevant personal data for NFTs, and especially when it comes to the transfer and all of that, usually happens off-chain, usually happens at the service provider level. For example, in the case of the typical licensing agreement, in most cases, the very few cases of licensing agreements that we have seen, or transfers of copyright, identifying the parties, who is the author of the artwork, who is the purchaser, the terms, etc., are being, drafted in a contract, in a traditional contract, if you want to call it, in comparison to a smart contract, and it's happening off-chain. And in that sense, no personal data is being introduced into that situation. So again, it's a situation that varies. And right now, what I'm seeing in the state of the art, in general, I would say that authors shouldn't be concerned about this. But again, it's something that it's a valid point to raise, but it's a situation that we have to be very careful when it comes to addressing that question, because the consequences can be, really troublesome. Like, for example, as I was mentioning before, trying to find who is the data controller, who has to comply with all of this, regulatory regime in a public blockchain can be a tricky question, not only from the practical side, but also when it comes to enforcement. Try to, put all the nodes of the Bitcoin blockchain in line complying with this kind of regulation. It's tricky to say the least.